up in the 1990s and leading into the 2000s, I always associated developer Naughty Dog with their bright and colourful platformers, most notably Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter. And even though I wasn't the biggest fan of either series, I understood the appeal. Crash Bandicoot played like a 2D platformer, in that you could only go in two directions, but the difference here was that it was in 3D, and you could go forward and back. It wasn't necessarily groundbreaking, especially when you put it against Nintendo's own Super Mario 64, which was not only a 3D platformer, but you had more exploration of each level. If you were already a Mario fan, you would be less likely to look at Crash and lean towards that instead, because Crash could be completed in 6 to 8 hours, whereas Mario had the player's attention for almost double that time. You had more to do in Mario 64, but I digress, I'm going way off topic. After the advent of the PlayStation 2 and 4 Crash Bandicoot games under their belt, Naughty Dog sought to develop a new franchise for the system, and they went ahead and created Jak and Daxter. Now, I've never actually sat down and played through a Jak and Daxter title, so I won't bore you with the details I know little about, but I will say this: Jak and Daxter was more open-ended than that of Crash Bandicoot. At its core, it's still a platformer, but you had more freedom to explore the levels, and there were many collectibles to accumulate as well. This became Naughty Dog's main focus pretty much throughout the PlayStation 2's life cycle until the PS3 was announced. It was then that Naughty Dog opted to create yet another franchise, this time away from the cartoonish, bright and colourful themes that Crash and Jak were set in. Well, Jak 1 and 2 at least. I believe Jak 3 was much darker in tone than the previous games, and went and created a more realistic looking game with actual human characters and real motion captured animations. Uncharted was released in November 2007 and was heavily inspired by the Tomb Raider series, if you couldn't tell. The developers claimed their inspirations came from that of Indiana Jones and National Treasure, which makes sense. I understand I'm focusing on the obvious, but the difference between Tomb Raider and Uncharted was that Tomb Raider was actually more heavily inspired by the original Prince of Persia, at least from a gameplay perspective, in that Tomb Raider focuses very much on careful platforming and puzzle solving, keeping the action sequences to a minimum in some cases, whereas Uncharted, while maintaining all of those elements, was much more action focused and emphasised gunplay, with puzzle solving and treasure hunting pretty much being part of that aspect. It's also kind of ironic that when the reboot of Tomb Raider arrived in 2013, the game took a lot of elements from Uncharted, including the focus on combat and stealth. The only major difference in the Tomb Raider games was the inclusion of more RPG elements and hunting mechanics, but you could definitely see a lot of Uncharted in that game. It's almost like a student becoming a master, as the Uncharted franchise has sold way more units than that of the rebooted Tomb Raider series, selling at 42 million, with the rebooted trilogy of Tomb Raider selling at just over 20 million. Now, if you were to include every Tomb Raider game in the series, that's obviously going to be a win for Tomb Raider, with more games and over 70 million units sold across its existence. That goes down with Age 2, but even then, Uncharted's unit sales are over half of the sales of every single Tomb Raider title. And Uncharted's only been around for 13 years as of this video, as well as 5 games, with Tomb Raider having way more than that. And Tomb Raider's been around for 25 years as opposed to those 13 years. It's hard to say if either series will continue to sell, because there doesn't seem to be any instalment of either franchise coming anytime soon. Wow. I'm going way off topic, way off track. I need to work on that. In any case, Uncharted is a proven success, and the series went on throughout the PS3's life cycle and bled into the next generation, with Uncharted 4 coming out on the PS4, as well as the spin-off to that game, Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, which is more like a side story to the already established Uncharted 4 story. But before the PS3 came to an end, Naughty Dog split their development team, and both were at work on 2 different games. One of them was Uncharted 3, and the other half was in charge of creating yet another brand new IP. This new game, according to the developer, was going to merge a number of different themes from various games and movies into this one particular game. and according to Neil Druckmann, he said he wanted to merge the gameplay of Eco, which is a game that was released in 2001, into a zombie apocalypse setting, with the lead character not dissimilar to John Hartigan, who is the main protagonist of the graphic novel series Sin City. He wanted the lead character to protect a young girl, but due to a heart condition, players would occasionally control said young girl, effectively changing up the playstyle on a regular basis. The Last of Us would be Druckmann's next project, and he took elements from this game he imagined and decided to apply some of it to this new IP. The Last of Us was eventually released in 2013 on the PlayStation 3 and was intended to be Naughty Dog's swan song title for the system before moving on to the next gen system at the time. The game was eventually re-released in 2014 under the title The Last of Us Remastered, and would include everything the base game had, including all downloadable content and story expansions. And it's this particular game I'm going to be taking a look at. So thanks for sticking with me this far. Welcome to GB Gaming. I'm Dave, and today I'm taking a look at The Last of Us. As I mentioned, The Last of Us was originally released on PS3 very late into its life cycle in June 2013, 5 months before the PlayStation 4 was due to come out. Then, just over a year later, it was remastered for the PS4 in July 2014. I played both iterations of this game, and in total I've beaten the game 3 times, with my latest completion being just a week prior to writing up this review, so it's very fresh in my mind, and I feel I know enough about it to warrant a review. And of course, The Last of Us Part 2 is coming out 2 weeks from this video, so of course I'm going to take advantage of that conversation. The game was, of course, developed by one half of the Naughty Dog team, with the other half being at work on Uncharted 3 at the time, and is more of a hybrid of genres rolled into one. It's an action game with heavy stealth elements with a zombie survival horror theme. It does nothing new in that regard, but what it does innovate on is the way the zombies are portrayed, as well as the story, and I'll get to both of those later on in the video. But for now, let's get to the story. Please note that if you have never played this game or you have yet to play it and are sensitive to plot related spoilers, consider this your spoiler warning, because I will be talking a lot about the beginning of the story of this game, as I believe it's important to talk about. The Last of Us begins with 2 characters, Joel and Sarah, and after about 10 minutes of getting introduced, there appears to be an outbreak happening around them. It doesn't take long for the game to hit this fact home, as we are then shown these characters escaping into the city to get safely away from what appears to be infected zombies. After running through the burning city, Joel and Sarah come across a soldier who believes them to be infected and opens fire on the two. Immediately we are hit with arguably one of the most emotional and hard-hitting scenes of any video game to date, as Sarah, Joel's daughter, was fatally shot and dies seconds after she's hit. That was one of the most horrible things I've ever seen portrayed in a video game up to this point. I've seen plenty of emotional scenes in games, but nothing to this calibre, nothing to this extent. So it was at this point I knew this game needed to be played from start to finish. So let's move on. The game then transitions 20 years later, and the virus is still very much alive, with quarantine zones all over the country. We take control of Joel in one of these quarantine zones, and it doesn't take long for the game to introduce us to another character, a young 14-year-old girl by the name of Ellie. We find out that she is infected, but has had the infection for 3 weeks, which contradicts the fact that the infection is supposed to occur after 2 days before it overtakes the host. Joel is then instructed by Marlene, the leader of a militia group called the Fireflies, to take Ellie to one of their facilities, as they believe her immunity to the virus will help create a cure. From then on, we witness the growing chemistry of these two characters and what they are willing to do to keep each other alive throughout this journey. Joel keeps his cards fairly close to his chest in the early chapters of this game, and the whole time Ellie tries her best to gain a relationship with him. A few moments into the game lead to their eventual care for each other, like a father-daughter relationship that Joel had lost 20 years prior, and they grow to be very protective of each other the later the game goes. Ellie is very feisty. She isn't your atypical video game portrayal of what a female character is supposed to be like. She isn't a whiny damsel like Ashley from Resident Evil 4. She's independent, she takes care of herself, and she doesn't take shite from anyone.
What? Tell them that Ellie is the little girl that broke your fucking finger!
She comes across as the voice of reason whenever Joel starts being mopey and negative.
I feel sick.
And you just hang back like I told you to.
Well, you're glad I didn't, right?
I'm glad I didn't get my head blown off by a goddamn kid.
You know what? No. How about, hey, Ellie, I know it wasn't easy, but it was either him or me. Thanks for saving my ass. You got anything like that for me, Joel?
Take all my food, too, while you're at it.
By the looks of it, you could lose some of that food.
You listen to me, you little shit.
No, fuck you! You handcuffed me!
I need you to shut up. All right?
You become attached to these two, as well as the characters they encounter, and there are times where the game will just rip the heart out of the player, and it makes you think there's almost no hope. The Last of Us really toys with the feelings of the player, and I think it's one of, if not the most important aspect of this game, and why I believe that it doesn't matter that the gameplay isn't that innovative, it's the story that is the main focus. Let's move on to the gameplay now. The Last of Us is a third-person survival horror themed action/stealth game, and it emphasises the stealth element 90% of the time. Throughout the game, you will encounter not only infected zombie-like creatures, but you will also have to eliminate actual human enemies as well. The game very much encourages the player to play the game with as little conflict as possible, especially early on. The term survival horror is also important, as it allows the player to craft weapons and upgrade equipment, much like Resident Evil 4 in some ways, in that Joel will carry a bag with him throughout the game, and every now and then you'll be able to craft weapons on the fly, such as Molotov cocktails, nail bombs and smoke grenades, and there will also be times where you will find workbenches. These are not that common, and only appear a few times in the game, so it's best to make use of them the moment you find one. They allow you to upgrade each of your main weaponry, such as increasing the range of your sniper scope, increasing your ammo capacity, reducing weapon sway and recoil. The more you upgrade, the more confident you'll be in combat. And even though this game doesn't take long to give you an arsenal of weapons at your disposal, it doesn't mean you can just play the game like Uncharted. I mean, you could try, but with the limited supplies and ammunition you carry, it's not very well encouraged unless you're dynamite at headshots. I mostly play the game as stealthily as possible, but there are occasions where I get impatient and just want to pop the last two enemies' heads off and move on to the next area. You can distract enemies by throwing bricks or glass bottles, and this allows you to neutralise enemies your way, instead of waiting for an enemy to go to a spot you want them to go to. The game by default helps in this regard by allowing you to enter what the game calls listening mode, which is essentially an X-ray vision mode that allows you to see enemies behind walls from the safety of your current position. Of course, it can be turned off, and at that point you have to use sound to your advantage, which I will get to in a moment. Enemies don't necessarily have much of a movement pattern. Some of them do, but if they are on alert, their movements tend to be randomised, and this can increase the tension and urgency of the player's actions. It makes for a very intense stealth game. I know I said randomised, that's probably not a very fair way to put it, because the enemies do coordinate with each other, but I'll get to that when I start talking about the enemies in this review. There are also plenty of collectibles in the game as well. I tried to get all of them in one playthrough without a guide, but I ultimately messed up because of the positioning of certain items you can grab. So I pulled up a guide the latter 3 chapters of the game, but there are well over 100 things to collect, including comic books, artifacts and pendants. The game also does its best to break up the enemy encounters in combat and relax the player by allowing you to strike conversations with another NPC at certain moments, as well as listening to Ellie's jokes that she reads from time to time to Joel from her joke book.
What is that?
It's a joke book. No pun intended. Volume 2 by Will Livingston.
Let's keep going.
I tried to catch some fog earlier. I missed. Do you know what's not right?
Left?
Yeah. That's awesome. What does a pirate say while eating sushi?
I don't know what.
Ahoy! Pass me some soy.
They help you get to know the characters more, and sometimes they provide intriguing backstories. The enemies you come across in The Last of Us range from human soldiers and bandits to infected zombies. The human enemies are just as you'd expect, but the AI is actually quite impressive. They will coordinate with each other, telling them to split up, and if you are hiding, they will search every nook and cranny until they find you. It discourages the player from sticking to the same spot and encourages them to move around and find ways to take enemies out one by one. It's also one of very few games where killing one enemy will affect the way other enemies will behave. It's very dynamic in that regard and is exceptionally impressive. There are times where there will be one enemy remaining, and if you attack them, they will surrender and plead with you to spare them. I never did this. I am Joel and I am desperate.
No, please.
However, it's the infected that are the most intriguing to me. They are not your typical zombie. They may act like them, but their story of becoming infected takes a much more semi-realistic approach to any other zombie game or movie that I have played and seen. Zombies are always born from bad experiments gone wrong, often caused by some poison substance creating a virus that spreads with every bite and contact. We've seen it all before. It's science that always causes the zombie. In The Last of Us, the infected creatures are infected due to a mutated strain of a fungus known as the cordyceps. The cordyceps fungus is a real fungus that actually exists. In real life, it attacks and invades the bodies of arthropods and insects, causing these fungal growths to emerge from them, often killing them. There is one species of the cordyceps fungi known as the Ophiocordyceps unilateralis that is the most famous species simply because it turns its host into a zombified state, and it's this particular species of cordyceps that is present in The Last of Us. The developer said that his idea for using this as a cause of the virus came from watching the BBC documentary series Planet Earth and a specific episode that focused on the fungus. Basically, the thought process was, what if this could attack humans? And it makes for a pretty uncomfortable setting, because Jesus Christ, what if it really could attack humans? The infection in the game is known as CBI, or Cordyceps Brain Infection, which serves as the source of the infection the game shows. It makes the enemies much more terrifying in this regard, rather than a simple G, T, E, D or Z virus gone awry. There are 4 stages of the virus that are presented in this game, and thus creates 4 different enemy types. You have the runner, which is an enemy during the first stage of the mutation. They only attack the player if they are provoked, and are usually passive otherwise. These are the least dangerous types of infected, and you can avoid them pretty easily if you just stay out of their way. You then have the second stage of the infection, known as the stalker, and they are usually identified by having slightly more fungi growing from their eyes and is much more cunning and clever as opposed to the runner, often having behaviour similar to that of a hunter, hence the name. The clicker is probably the most feared enemy in the game, and in my eyes the most difficult to avoid or kill. They are completely blind and use their sense of hearing to find enemies. They are pretty invulnerable to body shots and can only really be taken out with gunshots or blunt hits to the head. But actually getting close enough to hit them with a blunt weapon is very difficult to do. They are very sensitive to noise, and even the smallest sound can set them off, and at that point there's only so much the player can do. They are identified by the fungal bloom covering their head entirely, hence their blindness, and their ability to make clicking noises as they move. The fungus around their head is their weak point, so as I said, striking them repeatedly in the head will render them pretty much dead after a couple of hits. Getting caught by clickers is an instant death scenario unless you have unlocked the ability to stab them in the neck during the capture animation. And finally, there is the bloater. This is the final phase of the mutation. Bloaters are double in size and are completely covered in fungi, which allows them to have a very high strength and take much more hits to bring down. Their speed is their weakness, however, but is made up by their ability to throw spores at enemies, which will bring the player's health down slightly. Killing them with Molotov cocktails and flamethrowers is the most effective way to take them down. The Last of Us is absolutely stunning. It's Naughty Dog at their finest, going for quality over quantity. The game not only plays well, but it looks gorgeous. The realism in the characters' faces is definitely a highlight for me. Because this game uses full motion capture, it allows the characters to actually look and act very human. Whenever a character expresses a certain emotion, you can actually see that emotion come right out of them. It's an incredible feat, and there are so many games that do this, and I love it when it's done right. And this game is a perfect example of this. The atmosphere in the game is also beautiful. The world is covered in foliage and grass, and at times it almost looks real. There isn't much else I can say. I'm not very good at pointing out the signs behind it all, but all I can say is that Naughty Dog really did push the PS3 to its limits with this one. It looked good when I played it on PS3, it looked good when I first played it on a base PS4, and it looks much better playing it on a PS4 Pro with all the enhancements thrown in. This is a game that has aged beautifully, even after 7 years, and is a great example on how to do a remaster properly. The Last of Us looks just as good in 2020 as it did in 2013. Playing this game a third time was the first time I opted to play the game using my newly acquired Turtle Beach Stealth 800 headphones, which are probably the best headphones I've ever bought so far, and this game sounds absolutely incredible with them on. The PS4 version also brought in better directional audio for surround sound and better options to tweak the audio to your liking. The game was also optimised for the official Sony Gold headset, although I actually haven't had a chance to use them with the game, so I can't comment on it. The sound design is much more minimalistic than many other games I've played. The game emphasises quietness and eeriness, but when sound is needed, it's very important. When crouched behind a wall or table, it's not only important to see where enemies are using the game's listening mode, but there's a reason it's called listening mode, because you not only have to be aware visually, but you need to use the game's audio to your advantage as well. Wearing my headphones meant I was able to pinpoint exactly where enemies were if they weren't on my screen.
real situation here.
Playing the game on a higher difficulty level will completely disable listening mode, and it's at that point you really have to use your ears and crank up the volume. The game uses sound better than a lot of games I've played in the past, and normally I don't like to talk about the audio quality in games because I'm not very good at talking about it. But in this instance, especially from a sound effects point of view, I can really see where they went, and I really appreciate how well they've applied the audio design.
Where are they?
The music is equally minimalistic, but is also fitting to each setting and atmosphere. This is where I fall flat in my description on video game music, because I usually like all music in games, so I just appreciate it for what it is, and what this game's soundtrack is nothing short of amazing.
Back in Boston, back when I was bitten, I wasn't alone. My best friend was there.
About 7 months after the game's release, Naughty Dog released a midquel/prequel story DLC called Left Behind. It is set during two portions of the game's story, one of them being a present day section where you control Ellie during her attempt to find medical supplies for Joel during winter, and the other part being a backstory to Ellie and her friend Riley, who was originally mentioned near the end of the main game. This basically follows Ellie's relationship with Riley, and that's all I can say about it. And finally, there was also a multiplayer mode, because of course there is. I'm not typically much of a multiplayer guy anymore, although my recent Twitch sessions have contradicted this, so I naturally have never really been bothered with it, but I'll give a brief description. The online mode is called Factions MP, and it basically allows players to survive 12 weeks, and you can control either Hunters or Firefly. You basically have to gather supplies and keep everyone alive for the time given, and there's different game modes within it, so I'm not really sure, but from what I've seen, it was a pretty unique mode, I'll give it that. But I think I only played a portion of it, mainly to help a friend get a couple of trophies. I can't really remember much of it, so I won't get too far into it in case I'm wrong.
Can't hide forever, you know.
We took a beating, but we're not done yet.
Do I need to remind you what is out there?
Once upon a time, I had somebody that I cared about. And in this world, that sort of shit's good for one thing. Getting you killed.
The Last of Us came out of nowhere for me. It was released around a time where I didn't have much access to the internet for a while, so I didn't really see what new games were coming out. I only happened to see it when I went to my local GameStop to repurchase a PS3, and it was around that time I found the game sitting on the store shelf. It also came out a few months before GTA 5 came out, which was my most anticipated game that year, so every other game was pretty much getting ignored by me. But I bought it on the fly, because I just wanted something new to play. I went in completely blind, not knowing anything about it. No trailers, no reviews, nothing. The beginning of the game obviously shocked me. And it was that point I knew I was in for an experience I never had, disguised as a stealth horror game. As I said, it does nothing new or innovative, but what it does do is tell a wonderful emotional story, and sometimes that's all you need. The game had so many inspirations, and it shows. It takes elements from The Walking Dead, The Road, Planet Earth, I Am Legend, 28 Days Later, Children of Men, and so many others. The Last of Us didn't stop there though. Dark Horse Comics also released a comic book series of The Last of Us entitled The Last of Us American Dreams, and was only a 4-issue miniseries. It was released before the Left Behind DLC and does chronicle the journey of Ellie and Riley leading up to that part of the game. So if you want the whole story, I reckon this would be a good read, and I recommend you play it after beating The Last of Us but before playing Left Behind. And there you have it. I always wanted to review this game but never found the motivation to do so, and I also felt I hadn't played enough of it to warrant one. This recent playthrough felt like the right time, along with other factors. As I write this review, The Last of Us Part 2 has gone gold and is due to release around 2 weeks after this review has gone up, and is ultimately the reason I decided to go play through the original again. The review was a spur of the moment decision after I managed to get all my equipment back, and The Last of Us was very fresh in my mind, so it made sense to have that be my first review back on the channel. And with that said, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this review. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do, and if you didn't enjoy it, that's also perfectly fine. Maybe give me some feedback. I do these reviews purely out of my own enjoyment and nothing more. Anything above that is a bonus, so thanks again. This has been Dave talking to you on GB Gaming, where video games come first. Thanks again, and I'll be back with another review, hopefully soon. See you later.